In 1315, the King of England stopped at St. Albans on August the 10th and could not find bread. Not a political statement, not a symbolic gesture. Edward II, ruler of one of the wealthiest kingdoms on earth, literally could not eat. And if the king was going hungry in August, you can probably imagine what a peasant was dealing with by February. Actually, you cannot imagine it. Because everything you think you know about medieval winter is softer, warmer, and more survivable than the reality. The reality involved sleeping next to your cow for warmth, eating bread that might make your limbs fall off, and spending 6 months breathing smoke so thick it would violate every modern air quality standard by a factor of 1,000. And that was a good year. This is what winter actually looked like if you were one of the roughly 90 to 95% of medieval Europeans who lived in the countryside. Not a lord, not a monk, not a merchant in a walled city. A peasant. Bound to land you did not own, subject to a lord whose permission you needed to marry, change jobs, move away, or sell your own belongings. You survived winter by spending all of summer preparing for it, and even then, you often did not survive winter at all. The medieval world ran on margins so thin that a single bad harvest, a single cold snap, a single week without firewood could cascade into a death sentence for you and everyone you loved. And the thing about the medieval period is that it was not just one bad winter. It was century after century of them, getting progressively worse, punctuated by famines that killed 10% of entire nations and plagues that killed 60. So let us walk through it. Let us put you there. And let us see how long you last. The first thing you need to understand is the climate, because the weather is the engine that drove everything. The harvests, the famines, the plagues, and eventually the collapse of an entire way of life. From about 950 to 1250 CE, Europe enjoyed what climatologists call the medieval warm period. Temperatures across the North Atlantic were warmer by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius than early 20th century conditions, according to work by the British climatologist Hubert Horace Lamb, who examined historical harvest and precipitation records to reach that conclusion. 1 to 2 degrees does not sound like much. But those couple of degrees meant that vineyards in Germany extended up to 780 meters in elevation, compared to only 560 meters today. England itself was warm enough to grow wine grapes. Farmers could plant crops on land that would otherwise have been useless, and the resulting surplus fueled a population explosion that tripled the number of people living in Europe. And then the warmth stopped. Around 1300 CE, the climate shifted into what we now call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that lasted roughly until 1850. Average temperatures in the British Isles dropped by 2 degrees Celsius. Ice cores, lake sediment, coral, and tree ring data confirmed that Greenland, Scandinavia, the British Isles, and North America all experienced sustained cold, with temperatures falling 1 to 2 degrees below the average of recent centuries. So scholars typically break the Little Ice Age into 3 especially brutal cold periods: 1458 to 1552, 1600 to 1720, and 1840 to 1880. The River Thames froze repeatedly between 1400 and 1815, and during the Great Frost of 1683 to 1684, the most severe freeze recorded in England, the Thames froze solid for 2 full months, with ice reaching 11 inches thick in London. The cold got so extreme that it reshaped military strategy. In 1658, it enabled Charles X of Sweden to march his army across a frozen strait to capture the Danish island of Funen. In 1795, French cavalry seized a Dutch fleet that had frozen into the ice, which remains the only recorded instance in history of men on horseback, capturing a fleet of ships. But here is the thing. You are not a king, or a cavalry officer, or a Swedish general. You are a peasant standing in a rectangle of wattle and daub, watching your breath cloud in front of your face, and wondering if you have enough firewood to make it to March. Your home was a structure somewhere between 49 and 75 feet long and 13 to 20 feet wide, which works out to roughly 637 to 1,500 square feet. That sounds almost reasonable until you remember who else lived in it. In the longhouse design that became common from the 13th century onward, one end of the building housed your family, and the other end housed your livestock, because farmers could no longer pasture animals on depleted autumn fields and needed to keep breeding stock and dairy animals alive through winter. A single cow could produce the equivalent heat output of a small fireplace, so your animals were not just property. They were your heating system. What in many Icelandic longhouses, the stable was actually dug underneath the living quarters, so that the warmth rose through the floor into the family's space. The whole household, human and animal alike, tried not to freeze together. The walls of your home were framed with woven wattle, then plastered with a mixture of wet soil, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Once that mixture cured, it actually provided decent thermal mass and insulation. But the structure was still notoriously damp and drafty. Most dwellings featured single-layer stone or thatched roofs. Glass windows were expensive enough that your home likely had only one window, and it had no glass in it. You covered it with shutters at night for security and warmth, and during the day it was either open to the elements or sealed with paper. Yes, on the island of Margalone in southern France, even the windows of cathedral buildings were sealed with mortar during winter to reduce drafts. If the church itself was mortaring its windows shut, that tells you everything about what the wind did to a peasant cottage. Your primary heat source was a central hearth, an open fire burning in the middle of the room with smoke venting, if you were lucky, through a hole in the roof. Stockpiling enough firewood was one of the most critical autumn tasks you faced, because running out mid-winter was potentially as fatal as running out of food. If you froze, you could not perform the labor needed to acquire more fuel, which meant you stayed frozen, which meant you died. The hearth had to burn constantly. And what came off that fire was not just warmth. Measurements taken inside reconstructed Danish farmhouses during wood fire cooking found that fine particulate matter, the kind that embeds itself deep in your lungs, averaged between 21 and 160 micrograms per cubic meter in the living areas, with the World Health Organization's air quality guidelines constantly exceeded. Near the open hearth itself, 15-minute averages reached up to 25,400 micrograms per cubic meter, with carbon monoxide hitting 260 parts per million. To put that in perspective, the EPA warns that even short-term exposure to wood smoke can cause acute bronchitis, and repeated exposure leads to chronic bronchitis. You spent every winter night breathing this air. Cold, poorly ventilated homes filled with smoke from open hearths severely worsened lung conditions, and respiratory illnesses like pneumonia and bronchitis were constant killers. The damp, chilly air created perfect conditions for infection, and the fact that harsh weather forced everyone indoors turned each home into a breeding ground for contagious disease. Your family slept together near the hearth on beds of straw or ferns laid directly on the floor. Heat radiated from the livestock stalls at the other end of the house. You wore your clothes to bed because you owned, at most, one set of everyday clothing, a Sunday best outfit, a couple of shifts, a few specialist work pieces, a cloak for winter, and one or two warmer layers. Those wool garments were almost never washed during winter, and not because of laziness. Wet wool in freezing conditions could turn into a frozen shell, making movement nearly impossible. Or fur linings were the best insulation available, But fur was a luxury item. A peasant might own a fur-lined hat only if it had been passed down from someone wealthier. And even if you found a magnificent fur coat somewhere, society's rigid sumptuary laws meant you could not simply wear whatever kept you warmest. Your clothing had to reflect your social position, regardless of whether it left you shivering. You could freeze to death looking appropriately poor. The medieval hierarchy demanded it. Now let us talk about food, because this is where surviving winter went from miserable to mathematically grim. For most of the year, your diet was built on grains, wheat, rye, oats, or barley, and you consumed between 1 and 2 pounds of bread per day, usually alongside a bowl of pottage or a drink of ale. As the caloric math worked out to roughly 2,900 calories needed per day for an adult male and 2,150 for an adult female. Some estimates suggest peasants actually consumed around 4,000 calories daily, but they also burned approximately 4,500 through manual labor, which meant they were running a caloric deficit even in the best of times. Compare that to a modern American who eats about 3,000 calories a day, but burns only 2,000. Preparing for winter meant preserving as much food as possible using methods that had not changed since antiquity and would not change until the invention of canning in the early 19th century. Salt was your primary tool. Butchered meat was packed tightly into wooden barrels with layers of coarse salt between each cut or submerged in brine solutions. The result was tough, as intensely salty meat that required hours of boiling before it was edible, which is why boiled dishes dominated medieval winter cooking. Smoking and drying preserved meat and fish by hanging them over fires or air drying in cold climates. Fermentation transformed cabbage into sauerkraut, milk into cheese, and grains into ale. In medieval Germany, some peasants ate sauerkraut 3 or 4 times a day, which tells you both how effective fermentation was as a preservation technique and how limited your options were. Stockfish, cod that had been split down the middle, fixed to a pole and dried, was common in the medieval diet, though preparing it meant beating the dried fish with a mallet before soaking it in water. And remember, common ingredients you take for granted today simply did not exist in medieval Europe. No potatoes, no tomatoes, or no corn, no kidney beans, no chili peppers. None of those arrived until after 1492. Your winter vegetable options were hardy roots like turnips and leeks, supplemented by whatever you had managed to ferment or dry during the warmer months. November 11th was the feast of St. Martin, and on that day, rural communities across Europe performed their annual mass slaughter of livestock. Martinmas was the dividing line. Animals that would not earn their keep over winter, everything except breeding stock and dairy animals, were killed and salted. Charlemagne's court actually mandated detailed winter inventories of grain supplies on royal estates, requiring stewards to submit lists every Christmas of exactly how much wheat, barley, rye, and oats remained in storage. That level of accounting existed because the margin for error was 0, as every bushel mattered. And the farming yields that produced those bushels were shockingly low by modern standards. After a good harvest, medieval wheat might return 7 bushels for every one sown. After a bad harvest, the ratio dropped to 2 to 1. Modern agriculture achieves 30 to 1 or better. During the 13th century, favorable conditions could produce 10 bushels per one sown, but during the early years of the Great Famine, production collapsed by 1/3 to 1/2. Now we are about halfway through this story, and I should warn you that everything I have described so far, the smoke-filled houses, the frozen wool clothing, the caloric deficits, the livestock sleeping arrangements, that was normal life. That was a winter, where things went according to plan. What comes next is what happened when they did not. And it is significantly worse. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was the first of a series of catastrophes that broke medieval Europe. Wheat yield ratios had been declining since 1280, and food prices had been climbing steadily. The population was at an all-time high, thanks to 3 centuries of warm weather, and food production had virtually no margin for error. Then in the spring of 1315, it started to rain. Unusually heavy rain fell across much of Europe, and it did not stop. Throughout the spring and summer, the rain continued and temperatures stayed cool, meaning grain could not ripen. Crops failed across the continent. The 1314 to 1316 period turned out to be the 5th wettest 3-year interval in Europe between 1300 and 2012. Of the 4 wetter periods, 3 occurred after 1710, when agricultural technology was far more advanced. The timing could not have been worse. Prices doubled in England between spring and midsummer of 1315. In Lorraine, wheat prices rose by 320%, putting bread beyond the reach of ordinary people. A quarter barrel of wheat, about 13 kilograms, soared from 5 shillings to 40 shillings. For a penny, all you could buy was 2 small onions. The price of salt jumped from 30 to 40 shillings, and without salt, your ability to preserve food for winter collapsed entirely. Salt was described as the only bulk preservative available in places like Scotland, and without it, dairy went rancid within days, and meat and fish could not be stored at all. The famine stretched across an area of 400,000 square miles, touching Ireland, Great Britain, France, the Low Countries, much of Germany, and parts of Poland, Austria, and Scandinavia, home to an estimated population of 30 million people. Between 5 and 12% of the population of Northern Europe died from starvation or related disease. The south of England lost 10 to 15% of its people. Northern France lost about 10%. The Chronicle of Lanercost recorded such a mortality of men in England and Scotland through famine and pestilence as had not been heard of in our time. Crop failures lasted through 1316, and Europe did not fully recover until 1322. The human stories from the famine are the kind that stay with you. Parents who could not feed their children abandoned them in towns or in forests. People ate dogs and horses. They stripped forests bare of edible roots, grasses, nuts, and bark. By 1317, the starving people had eaten much of the seeds intended for the next season's crops, which meant the following year's harvest was also doomed before it began. Medieval chronicles hint at cannibalism, and while most historians consider these references deliberate exaggeration meant to emphasize the severity of the crisis, one Scottish account describes a figure called Christy Cleck, who allegedly ambushed women, children, and young people and survived on their flesh. Some peasant communities were simply abandoned, especially in Ireland and the Lübeck region of northern Germany. Parts of rural France remain less populous today than they were before the Great Famine, 7 centuries ago. The livestock did not fare any better. The Great Bovine Pestilence caused sheep and cattle numbers to fall by as much as 80%. The records from Ramsey Abbey in England show catastrophic herd declines. In one manor, only 6 of 48 animals survived. In another, the number of cows dropped from 45 to 2. Life expectancy tells the story in a single number. According to records from the English royal family, average life expectancy at birth in 1276 was 35.28 years. During the Great Famine, between 1301 and 1325, it dropped to 29.84 years. And then, between 1348 and 1375, during the Black Death, it collapsed to 17.33 years. The plague killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1353, an estimated 25 to 50 million people on the continent alone, and perhaps 75 million worldwide. Florence went from 110,000 to 120,000 inhabitants in 1338 to 50,000 by 1351. Over 60% of Norway's population died between 1348 and 1350. When plague finally reached Iceland in 1402, the island's population dropped from 120,000 to 40,000 within 2 years. In most parts of Europe, it took 80 years for population sizes to recover. In some areas, it took more than 150. And throughout all of this, there was another killer hiding in the bread. After cold or wet winters, or following a damp spring, a fungus called Claviceps purpurea could infect rye from the previous harvest. By summer, the bread baked from that grain could be poisonous. The disease it caused was called ergotism, and its effects were the stuff of genuine nightmares. Consuming ergot-tainted flour triggered convulsions, seizures, and vivid hallucinations, often of demons or animals. Blood flow to the extremities was restricted, leading to gangrenous limbs that eventually fell off, that sufferers believed they were crawling with insects or engulfed in flames. Medieval people knew the condition as holy fire, or St. Anthony's fire, named after the monks of the Order of St. Anthony, who dedicated themselves to treating it. The earliest recorded reference to ergotism appears in the Annales Xantensis for the year 857, describing a great plague of swollen blisters consumed the people by a loathsome rot, so that their limbs were loosened and fell off before death. The peasantry and children were the most susceptible, though entire villages could end up relying on tainted crops during times of famine. When that happened, ergotism reached into every house. Documented epidemics killed tens of thousands across the Middle Ages. And in a detail that bridges medieval horror to American history, the convulsive symptoms from ergot-tainted rye may have been the source of the accusations of bewitchment that fueled the Salem witch trials, a theory first proposed by Linda R. Caporale in 1976 in the journal Science. A medieval fungus growing on medieval grain, causing medieval hallucinations, potentially responsible for one of the most famous episodes of mass hysteria in the New World. The past has a long reach. Even in years without famine, without plague, without poisoned bread, winter had one final punishment waiting for you. Early spring, the season that was supposed to bring relief, was actually the most dangerous time of all. Historians call it the hungry gap, the weeks when your winter stores were exhausted, but new crops had yet to mature because the ground was still frozen. You survived on whatever hardy roots remained, or turnips and leeks mostly, supplemented by foraged greens like nettles and dandelions. This was the period when malnutrition tipped into starvation, when weakened immune systems surrendered to pneumonia, and when the cold claimed those who had almost made it through. Some people found a solution of sorts. They slept through it. An official 1844 report from Burgundy describes how French peasants, after repairing their tools following the wine harvest, will now spend their days in bed, packing their bodies tightly together in order to stay warm and to eat less food. A 1900 British Medical Journal report on peasants of the Pskov region in northwestern Russia noted they adopt the economical expedient of spending half the year asleep, waking once a day to eat a piece of hard bread, while family members took turns tending the fire. So after 6 months of this reposeful existence, the report noted, the family wakes up, shakes itself, and goes out to see if the grass is growing. Historians and economists who ventured into the French countryside after the revolution were horrified to find the workforce had vanished between fall and spring. Fields lay deserted from Flanders to Provence, and villages were silent with barely a column of smoke revealing a human presence. As soon as the cold arrived, people across France shut themselves away. In the Alps, peasants described their year as 7 months of winter, 5 months of hell. The hell being unremitting toil in warmer weather, followed by cold months, spent sealed inside with their cows and pigs. A geographer named Raoul Blanchard, writing in 1909 in the journal La Géographie, was recorded how the inhabitants of Queyras in the French Alps re-emerge in the spring, dishevelled and anemic. That was the rhythm of medieval life. You worked yourself to exhaustion during the warm months, laid in every ounce of food and fuel you could manage, and then retreated into a dark, smoky room to wait out the cold while eating as little as possible and hoping you had enough to make it through. No amount of preparation guaranteed survival. A wet summer could rot your grain. A cattle plague could wipe out your herd in weeks. A cold snap could freeze your stores, or your fingers, or your children. And the church's only medical advice was that your illness was divine punishment for sin, best treated by bleeding, sweating, or induced vomiting to rebalance the bodily humors. Also, here is what surviving a medieval winter actually meant for you. It meant living in a structure that was part barn, part smokehouse, part bedroom, sharing your air with livestock and particulate matter at levels that would shut down a modern factory. It meant wearing the same unwashed wool for months because getting it wet would turn it into a frozen straitjacket. It meant eating salted meat so tough it needed hours of boiling, sauerkraut 4 times a day, and bread that might, in a bad year, cause you to hallucinate demons before your toes turned black and fell off. It meant watching your food stores shrink week by week while the ground stayed frozen and spring refused to come. It meant that if the rains came at the wrong time, or the cold lasted a few weeks too long, or the harvest came in a third below normal, but you and your family joined the 10 to 15% of the population that simply disappeared from the records. You had no way to control the temperature in your home, no way to preserve food beyond salt and smoke, no way to leave your lord's land without permission, no way to wear warmer clothes if they were above your station, no knowledge of what caused disease, let alone how to prevent it, and no guarantee, none at all, that the winter you were enduring would not be the one that ended you. Medieval infant mortality hovered between 30 and 40%, meaning 3 to 4 out of every 10 children born did not survive infancy. The average life expectancy numbers, those grim figures of 30 to 40 years, say reflected not a population dying in middle age, but a population so brutalized by childhood mortality that the average was dragged down before most people even had a chance to grow up. If you made it past childhood, you might live into your 50s or 60s. But making it past childhood in a medieval winter was the hard part. The 14th century delivered famine, then plague, then more famine, then more plague. Localized famines struck France in 1304, 1305, 1310, 1315 to 1317, 1330 to 1334, 1349 to 1351, 1358 to 1360, 1371, 1374 to 1375, and 1390. England added its own in 1321, 1351, and 1369. The fear and anxiety created by repeated crop failures during the Little Ice Age fueled a surge of witch trials and anti-Semitism, because when your children are starving, someone must be to blame. And the medieval mind did not reach for climate data. By 1381, the accumulated pressure of the Black Death, high taxes from the 100 Years' War, and the daily indignities of serfdom exploded into the peasants' revolt, led by Wat Tyler, who demanded an end to the poll tax, removal of the cap on labor wages, redistribution of church wealth, and the total abolition of serfdom. The revolt failed. Serfdom endured. John Wildman wrote in 1648 that the cries and tears of the poor, who profess they are almost ready to famish, had raised fears that a sudden confusion would follow. The English traveller John Aylmer, writing in 1559, observed of French peasants, "Oh, if thou sawest the peasants of France, how they are scraped to the bone, and what extremities they suffer, what thou wouldest think thyself blessed." That last part is the real lesson here. Not that medieval winters were cold, which you already knew. Not that medieval life was hard, which you already assumed. But that the entire system, the climate, the agriculture, the medicine, the social order, was designed so that the people who produced the food, built the homes, and did the labor were also the people least likely to survive the season when labor stopped and the cold set in. A monk at Westminster Abbey received an allowance of 1 gallon of beer per day and consumed 6,000 calories on normal days, dropping to a mere 4,500 when fasting. You, the peasant who grew the grain that brewed that beer, went to bed hungry in a smoke-filled room, hoping your cow's body heat would keep your children alive until morning. That was the medieval contract. You worked, they ate, and winter came for whoever was left.